Good morning and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for our second exclusive webinar organized in collaboration with our value partners at Lightcast International. Today's topic will be HR Next Level Skills Velocity Unleashed Navigating Tomorrow's Workforce. My name is Alessandra Buffoli, Sales and Marketing Support Manager of Monster Italia. It's my pleasure to guide you through today's session where we'll tackle three key areas. The talent crunch, how can company overcome labor shortages with innovative solutions? Skills velocity, how do you keep up with rapid skill changes through continuous learning? And the future ready workforce. How can data driven decisions help you adapt and succeed in a changing labor market? I'm pleased to introduce our expert speakers who will be sharing their knowledge and experience. Alison Etheridge, Director of Global Talent Intelligence at Lightcast, and Elena Magrini, Head of Global Research at Lightcast. Before we dive into our agenda, let me take a moment to introduce Monster and share why we are so passionate about driving success in recruitment and talent management. For more than 30 years, Monster has been synonymous with innovation and reliability in the world of recruiting. We are more than just pioneers of job boards. We are true partners in recruitment marketing, offering tailored solutions and effective strategies to attract top talent. At Monster, we leverage our innovative pay for performance model to guarantee visibility and measurable results, helping you find what truly makes your company unique. People. Monster is where employers and candidates connect, creating winning matches for a successful professional future. In Monster, in 2024, we reached more than 57 million visits and more than 10 million job applies, with a growing candidate database of 1.5 million new profiles. With our 24/7 visibility performance marketing campaigns, our jobs can reach the desired candidates across all key platforms, thanks to the impressive number of impressions we deliver in 2024, a total of 733 million of impressions. Now, with our innovative pay for performance model, you have the power to fully control your recruitment budget and maximize your reach. Our performance campaigns connect you to talent across more than 200 sites, ensuring you visibility and valuable insights every step of the way. Plus, you will benefit from a dedicated customer success manager focused on delivering faster and more effective hiring results. And with a total flexibility over and when and how you post your jobs, you are always in control. It's smart, efficient, and designed to help you achieve the best hiring outcomes and budget return. Now, thanks to our joint venture with Career Builder, we are delivering a new experience, expanding our impact on a global scale. Thank you again for joining us today, and we look forward to an engaging session and to sharing actionable insights you can use to enhance your talent strategies today and in the future. So now let's get started, and I'm pleased to leave the floor to Elena.
Thank you, Alessandra, for the introduction. And before we go into the details of the research and the insights and the discussion, let's spend a couple of moments to talk about also Lightcast and who we are and why we're here together today. At Lightcast, we are the global leader in labor market analytics, and basically we have over 20 years of experience working with private companies, but also education providers and governments to understand questions related to the labor market and navigating changes in the labor market, which, as we will hear a lot about today, is changing quite fast and is changing in quite unprecedented ways. And so we need to be prepared for these changes. The way we work with companies really varies, but the bottom line is that we sit on a wealth of data related to the labor market. We sit on the most comprehensive data set on the labor market, which includes data on companies, job postings, profiles from workers, as well as data from official statistics from over 150 countries across the world. And we work with organizations in many different ways, from providing data and software through data shares or through professional services. So a lot of what we will be talking about today is based on the data that we sit on. And as you said at the beginning, Alessandra, the question for today is threefold, and we're trying to understand how we make a future ready workforce. So, yeah, let's just jump in. The first thing that we're gonna talk about today is around what are the key trends in the labor market that we're seeing in 2025. There's quite a lot going on in the labor market. I normally start, when I'm asked to present about the labor market, I normally start with a slide like this. And actually, in the last few months, I had to change these slides quite often because the things that are actually changing the labor market keep changing themselves. And there's a lot going on at the moment. We have demographic shift that have been happening for a few years, and they're really hitting the labor market right now. But we also have emerging topics like geopolitical instability, something relatively new that has happened in the last few months. And then in middle, we also have changes in the skills required because of growth in the rise of AI, the green transition. And then there's also labor mobility, migration, polarization and inequalities. There are changes expectations because there are many different generations in the labor market, and all generations want different things. So there's a lot going on at the minute. And I don't know if Alessandra or Alison, you have other comments on this as well.
I think what's really interesting about this piece, and that you're so right, Elena, on everything is changing, particularly when we think about a future ready workforce, which we'll get onto a little bit later. Business leaders used to make a lot of decisions based on their gut, and their gut was based on experience, right? So there was some validity to it. But none of us have experienced a labour market that is doing what today's labour market is doing. And so therefore your gut feel is not based on experience that is relevant to today's labour market. So the need to make data driven decisions becomes even more relevant.
Yeah, and Alessandra, is this something that you experience as well? What are the key changes, factors affecting the organizations you work with?
Yeah, absolutely. Especially what we are still seeing is really the big challenges, the big difficulties for company is really the skills gap. And actually, also this year, when we talk with our clients, with our customers, they are still struggling with this kind of gap. And also, according to our latest future of work survey, we have seen that training rather than technology remains the primary solution for addressing talent shortages. For example, in Germany, there is a growing shift towards a dual approach that combines training with technology driven strategies. The 58, for example, of German employers are more likely to adopt technology to help bridge the skill gap.
Yeah, that's interesting. And actually, there's quite a lot that it links to in terms of today's presentation. So what I'm going to do now is, when we talk about all these things that happen in the labor markets, in my mind, then we can boil them down in terms of like trying to think about how we go about addressing these problems into two big questions. On one end, we have questions related to who is going to do the work. So where do we find the people that we need to get into the jobs that we need to fill? So the skills gap, skill shortages, how do we meet those requirements for companies? And then the second bracket is around how's the work going to get done. So here you find the people, but the skills these people need are different because the labor market continues to change and the requirements related to it. And so this is more around the training or how the skills are changing within the jobs. So what I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about some of the key findings that we find for both of these questions before we get into solutions and practical applications. Starting on who is going to do the work. This is a question that is actually becoming really pressing lately because the US is getting on the cusp of having a really big demographic challenge. But here in Europe, it's something that we've been seeing for quite some time. Talent scarcity is one of the biggest challenges for companies that are competing for talent. The competition is only becoming fiercer because at a global level, the number of people that are getting into the workforce is growing more slowly than it used to in the past. And it's not just growing more slowly. In 8 out of 10 countries globally is expected to slow over the next few years. And in 3 out of 10 countries, and most of these countries are in Europe and in East Asia, population is expected to decline. So there are fewer people for the same amount of jobs that there were before. And so this is a big challenge. We have a few strategies to address this challenge. Normally, migration is one of the ways that countries that are facing talent shortages try to address these shortages. But actually, net migration is also projected to decline. And this is especially the case for developed countries. And so that means that the biggest pool of talent that we, as in developed countries, used to rely on in terms of filling jobs is also declining. Now, on the more positive side, we know that we are seeing an increased labor market participation by groups that traditionally were not part of the labor market or that were less likely to be in the labor market, for example, women. But even here, we need to be careful because that doesn't fill all the gaps that we're seeing in the labor market. So if you're a company, talent scarcity is one of the biggest challenges, and this is only going to get worse. Now, is it going to get worse everywhere in the same way? Not. That's not the case because different countries are on different trajectories when it comes to these trends. But when we zoom in on the countries that we are focusing on today, which is around Europe, what we see is that a lot of the European countries are struggling with these challenges. And here on these metrics, what we did was we tried to categorize countries into 4 groups based on the challenges they're facing in terms of demographics. And then going back to something that Alessandra said earlier, on one axis, we're seeing the demographic challenge. And then on the other axis, we are seeing the capacity of different countries to absorb technology and innovation to face these challenges. And so if you are in the top right quadrant here, so the one that's called higher opportunity, these are places where the population is growing and there is a lot of absorptive capacity in terms of innovation to continue to grow. And so these places are like in a happy place where they can have a lot of opportunities. But what we want to highlight here is the places that are in the bottom left quadrant and then also in the top left quadrant. These are part of the world where the working age population is not growing, it is declining. And for some of them, they have really good innovative capacity, like in Japan, in Germany, Singapore, France also is in there. And so that means that even if they're facing talent shortages, they are at a lower risk in terms of addressing these shortages because they have innovative capacity. But then there are a whole bunch of countries, especially in Southern and Eastern Europe. So we're seeing a lot of countries like Greece, Romania, Croatia, Portugal. These are countries where their working age population is not growing, is declining, and they don't have enough absorptive capacity in terms of innovation to address these changes through innovation and automation. And so these are really countries that are at risk when it comes to the talent shortages challenge. And this is the first key finding for today.
I think it's really interesting, this one, because we're no longer talking about do we have people with the skills. We're talking about do we have people. Right? So that's a big question, right? And it shows that there's opportunity, as many of us know, there's opportunity in places like Africa where you have a large population, but actually what we've got to do is work on how we help those populations become more innovative and more able to take advantage of the opportunity. But if you are a global corporate right now, headquartered in kind of the US, the UK, or in Europe, you're facing these challenges more acutely than anyone else.
Yeah, and it's kind of scary in my mind when you combine this with the second part of the key findings around even if you do find the people, then you got to get them to have the skills that are relevant to the labor market, which, as we said, is changing quite fast. And on that, I wanted to show you a couple of stats around how fast is changing the labor market. So the challenge here is not finding the people, is keeping up with the pace of skills change for existing roles. And here we've done some research at Lightcast looking at the skill requirements within different occupations and how these have changed over the past few years. And what we found is that a third of the skills in a given occupation have changed over the past 3 years. So on average, 30% of the skills that are required in a job have changed. And when we look at the occupations that have changed the most, 75% of the skills have changed. So that's quite a big, significant change. Not only that, but the pace of change that we've seen in the past 3 years is equivalent to the pace of change that we've seen in the prior 5 years. So it is really accelerating what's happening in the labor market. And there's quite a lot going on, and we were trying to understand what are the factors that are affecting this. And it boils down to three main factors, which are the ones that you see here on the slides, although they're not the only ones. But worth mentioning them because they're really playing a key role in how the labor market and skill challenges are shaping up. First one is artificial intelligence, and not only artificial intelligence, but in particular generative AI. And we are seeing that these trends are affecting not just tech jobs, but are really coming into the labor market, especially in non-tech roles. Then we have the growth of green skills. The green transition means that new jobs are being created, but also existing one needs to be updated for new green skills. And then cybersecurity. The increased threats around securities are also really affecting the labor market and changing requirements in terms of skills.
So that
Yeah.
means that if you're in a job right now, you need to be continuously, as an individual, continuously reinventing yourself. You're being asked the whole time, what's the job that you're now asking me to do, and how does that differ from 3 months ago? And I think therefore it feels a little bit as if we're now moving towards, we're going in this direction, not we're going to this destination, right? And therefore that's why people are talking about things like continuous learning, right? Because it's how do I evolve myself and therefore my workforce in order to meet these changing needs.
Yeah, and it's almost like well, we never had a crystal ball, so we could never see what the future was like. But now, like, it's almost pointless because it's changing so fast
Yeah.
that spending time predicting what it looks like is just not helping. What we need to do is prepare for these changes, and as you say, continuing to train and learn is one way that we can do that and be prepared. And again, here, the thing is that we are seeing these changes happening, but they're not happening at the same pace everywhere. And this time, everywhere is not by different countries, but it is by different industries.
Really interesting, because actually one
Yeah.
of the things we heard last week was that an organization can't reinvent itself faster than its people. Right? So the focus has got to be, how do we reinvent our people fast, which is why you need to maximize kind of jobs, people, skills that you need for the future, presumably.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and in addition of what you have just shared, what we are seeing is that companies are beginning to look for candidates based on their skills rather than job titles. And this represents a significant step forward in reducing the current talent scarcity.
Yeah, and I'm sure Alison will want to touch on this as well when we get into the solutions, because I think that's is becoming more and more the norm, but also it's the key for employers to actually unlock new talent. And just before we get into that, I just wanted to show you some numbers on the diversity on the labor market. So before, we saw how the changes in relation to talent scarcity vary by different countries. As I was saying, when it comes to skill change, the changes actually vary by a career area. And here are just a few examples from the research that we've done looking at change, and it shows numbers for different occupations on how much they change. The number itself don't mean anything apart from the bigger the number, there's more change, and the smaller the number, the less change. And what it really says here is that occupations like a clinical data system specialist, data scientist, validation engineers have changed quite a lot in terms of skills requirements over the last couple of years. Whereas instead, if you think of a dishwasher or a cook, their skills haven't changed that much. And this makes sense. Like when we think about it, it kind of intuitively makes sense. But it is important to understand these nuances, because it means that companies need different strategies depending on the type of roles that they're recruiting for or that they currently have in their organization.
It's so interesting, this one, because if you asked people what jobs do you think have got the biggest skills change, they're going to say things like data scientists, and they're going to say things like software engineers. They're unlikely to say things like marketing specialist or loan officer or recruiter, right? And particularly for this audience, right, there's massive change in terms of the job that you are now asking me to do is very different from the job that you were asking me to do. And that has a big impact on organizations that are non-tech businesses.
Yeah, and on that point, actually, every time I show this slide, one of the things that I'm always super keen to highlight is that every occupation is facing change. The fact that the number is lower, it doesn't mean that it's not facing change. It does mean that it's facing less change than other occupation. But this is happening pretty much everywhere in the labor market. There's only, like, you can literally pretty much count on one hand, the number of occupations that literally haven't changed at all over the last 3 years. So there is a lot of change. And then also, if you combine the change in terms of some jobs are facing skills changing, the jobs that don't face skill changing oftentimes face talent scarcity challenges. So there's a lot going on in the labor market. So I think that's also why it's super important that we talk about what do we do about this if we are organizations.
So whatever happens, it's not easy, I guess, is where we landed there.
No, exactly. So maybe now I'll leave the floor to you, Alessandra and Alison, on how you can do about this. So how can we take data-driven decisions? And leave it to the expert to share how you're doing it in practice.
Okay, so let me talk then, if I may, and Alessandra, please ask me questions if you want to through this. So
Sure.
what we're hearing is there's a lot changing in the labour market. We're hearing there's a lot of skills-based focus, and then we're hearing my gut may not be right any longer, right? Or my gut needs something. And so I think the first thing to explore is really around, we talk about labour market intelligence as if everybody's going to know what we mean by that. So the starting point, I think, is drawing back from that and just saying, what is labour market intelligence and what is available? And I think that's interesting for our audience to think about. And if you think about information on people or information on jobs or information on companies, there's loads of data. Yeah, Alexandra went through the data that Monster holds, right? And Elena went through some of the data that Lightcast holds. There's loads of data that's out there, but the data's really messy. It's really unstructured. It's in literally thousands of different places. And it's all in what I would call a different language. And I don't mean just a different language based on the country, but a different language generally. So, Alessandra, you talked earlier about people looking for skills and not job titles as a really good example.
Yeah.
Job titles make no sense in today's world, right? Because they're outdated and they're unstructured. So if you look at my job title, so my job title now is Global Talent Intelligence Director. My job title previously was Chief Believer, right? There's no way anybody could really use those job titles and say, what can Alison do? And what are the skills that Alison can do? So that's the way that I look at, kind of what is labour market data. Does that make sense, Alessandra?
Yeah, and so Alison, based on your experience, what sort of data can be used, and where does it come from?
That's a really good question. So we think of that data in three buckets, right? So one of those buckets is about the supply of people. So a little bit as Elena was saying, how many people are there? And that could come from profiles, right? And thinking about online profiles. And I don't mean profiles necessarily that people have just got on Monster or on LinkedIn or wherever it might be, but there is information about a person and the job that they do in all sorts of places. So, researchers on ResearchGate, for example. So there's lots of information around people. And then there's also lots of government data that's linked to how many people are doing what job in a particular place. The next bucket, if you like, of data is around demand. So what are the jobs that people are advertising? What are the skills that people are advertising? Are they going up or are they going down? Where are they being advertised? So it's much more about the demand for those skills. And you can't look at one of those things without looking at the other. You have to look at them in alongside each other. Because if you've got a low supply, but you've also got a low demand, it doesn't matter, right? But if you've got a low supply and high demand, it really matters. And equally, listening to that, if you, as an individual, as a company who's hiring, if the supply is low and you only want a low number, equally, it doesn't matter. But if the supply is high, but you also want a big percentage of that supply, then it does matter. So you can't just look at the numbers. You have to look at the numbers in order to bring context. And again, lots of government data can underpin both the postings data, job advertisements data for demand, and profile data. And then the third bucket is around companies. And if you think about company data, that could be on company's website, it could be on regulated industry or government bodies. So again, you've got data all over the place, but it's how you bring that together. What I think is really important in this place is that people think of labour market intelligence as just that, just as data and not as insight. But when I'm talking to business leaders about their workforce and what their plans are for their workforce, and I say to them, in what other space would you make decisions about where to grow or where to put a factory or where to build a new facility without understanding the context? What other business function would you do that in? And the answer is always, well, we wouldn't. You need context. And so I think that's what's really important, is that you can use the labour market to give you some context to some of the decisions that you're making, as well as tactically on some of the recruitment pieces that you're doing. I think that also is quite interesting because it leads into some of the user cases that we hear from people. So typically speaking, individuals using labour market data in enterprise, and forgive me, I'm talking through the lens of enterprise. I'm not talking through the lens of necessarily educators or public sector. But when we look through the lens of enterprises, the individuals normally sit in talent acquisition or talent management, right? And so they're not normally feeding in to strategy. And yet labour market data can be used both tactically, but also it can be used very strategically. So some of those pieces that we just touched on about where do we relocate a new factory or where do we grow our business are really big strategic decisions. But you've then also got some tactical user cases. And Alessandra, I think this plays into what you were saying earlier about people looking for skills and not for titles, typically now. And that is historically, recruiters would talk to hiring managers, and hiring managers will say, well, what are you doing? The people are there. It can't be that hard. And so it was always the recruiter's fault. And I'm sure there will be people nodding away as they hear that. But labour market data can be used by a recruiter, by talent acquisition, to enable a different conversation with your recruitment leader. So instead of saying, go away, find them, there must be people there, and then going back and going, well, there aren't any people, you could actually now have this conversation that says, I know you want someone with 10 years experience, and I know you think that these 5 skills are essential. But when we add those criteria in, there's only 4 people in the place that we're looking who can do the job, and 2 of them work for us already, right? So it's just a different conversation with the hiring manager. But if you can then, you have to be able to give a solution, right? You can't, as a recruiter, you can't just go, well, I told you there weren't any people there. You have to be able to give a solution. And the solution is to say, look, if we drop from 10 years experience to 7 years experience, and if we went for these 4 skills instead of these 5 skills, this is what happens to the size of the market that opens up to us. So now let's have a conversation, Mr. or Mrs. Hiring Manager, about whether or not we can do that, whether or not that's a sensible way for us to approach this role. And I think that plays into what you were saying, Alessandra, about people now saying, okay, let's look through the lens of skills and not through titles. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. And trying to summarize, what do you think are really the main benefits of becoming a skills organization?
So skills is really interesting. So we need, and this is what we're seeing, right? People are using labour market data and they're now saying, hold on, we need to look at a more granular way of looking at the way that work is done and the way that we look at our people. And I don't know if this analogy will work, so I'm going to try without a visual. If you think of a person as being made up of lots of building blocks, right? So think Lego bricks, right? And each of those Lego bricks is a different skill, right? So here is Alison, and I'm made up of lots of different skills. If I then put Alison next to other people, and again, you're looking through the lens of those little building blocks, and you're able to start moving them around, then you're able to start seeing how you could build the skills that you need within your organization across your team and across your workforce. So I think that analogy works. I think yeah, okay, good. We might need to do a visual around it, but I think it works. But so therefore, to answer your question then more directly, if you're looking at people and you're looking at work in that more granular way, then actually you can start to create a much more agile workforce, right? Suddenly you've got a workforce that you can adapt to market changing. You could redeploy your talent based on the capability rather than based on the job title of chief believer, right, or global talent intelligence director. You can start to deploy your talent. So that's the first. I think the second is, and this is interesting, in a labour market that's as tight as we're seeing now, what we hear from people is, for the first time, actually, we can see underutilization in our workforce. So that's mad. We have a tight labour market externally, but internally we might have some underutilization. So suddenly you're able to maximize your workforce potential because you could leverage an employee's full range of skills, right? And start to reduce the skills gap. And then the third, and this is really relevant in the conversation that we're having today, is actually you do better hiring and you have better retention by looking through the lens of skills rather than credentials, right? And we've seen organizations deliver really strong ROI by just stripping out a credential or an employment population. So you can tap into wider, more diverse talent pools, and you can improve your retention by targeting your development opportunities. There's definitely cost efficiency and productivity to be gained by becoming skills based, but there's a big but, because it's also really easy to do it badly.
And there's a danger in doing it badly as well.
You know, and I think that yeah, the benefits are very real, okay, in this space. But you have to recognize that if you're going to become skills based and you're going to do it at scale, which is what we're talking about here, you have to start small, right? Because if you start with everything, then you're creating chaos within your organization. Moving towards becoming more agile, more forward looking, more holistic in your workforce is not an HR project. It is full business transformation, right? And therefore, it's really important that the starting point is, what is our business why? Why are we doing this? What impact do we want to have from it? And who do we need to bring on the journey in our leadership teams and within our employee base? Because if you don't do that, it's really easy to get it wrong. And at a fundamental level, right? So even if we're just looking through the lens of data as a good example, it's really easy to build a skills taxonomy. Right? It's really easy to build a skills taxonomy that links to titles. It's quite hard to maintain that taxonomy because of the pace of change that Elena was talking about. And it's really hard to keep it relevant in a marketplace where skills are changing all the time and new skills are emerging. So even if you just look at the underlying data layer and say, right, how do we make this relevant? That's a good example.
Yeah, and I think on that one, maybe that's where it links to why benchmarking matters. Because it's not just about the type of data that you use, but it's also about how you use it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because if you have things in the same language, right? And I mean the same skills language and the same titles language. This is not something you can do with a clever piece of black box AI, right? You need to have a person in the loop in order to make this work. But if you've got something in the same language, then there's two really important things that can come out of it. The first is, suddenly you can compare your internal data to your external data, right, in the same language. So then you can start to say, okay, so that the workforce that we have here has got maybe 70% of the skills that they need in order to complete this action. But if we hired that same workforce externally, they command a 50% salary premium, right? So do we want to be spending that money and going through that disruption, or should we invest some of that money in retraining and redeploying the talent that we have internally? And you can only do that and have that sort of benchmarking conversation if your internal data and your external data are in the same language of skills and titles. So that's the first point. The second bit, I think, is where it gets really exciting, actually, because the first piece is where magic happens in an organization. You can really start to deliver very different strategies. But the second bit is where business leaders start to sit up and go, "Ooh, that's interesting," right? And that's linked to being able to compare yourself to your peers or to your competitors or to what other businesses are doing. So if I think about that, you can imagine a business leader saying, what is our ratio of salespeople to engineers, right? And how does that compare to the market? And you're able to then make some decisions about whether or not you think one of your peers or your competitors is more competitive and why that might be. Or you might say, what are the skills that we're seeing our competitors hiring now? And that's really interesting because that's an early indicator of business direction. So now you're into actually much more strategic use of skills and labour market data. Or it might be that you're saying, where are we losing talent to? Which companies are we losing talent to? And at what level and with what skills? And is that indicative of their future direction? So I think that ability to say, how do we compare internally and externally, but also that outward in view enables you to have actually very different conversations as an organization. And if I just give you some examples, if you're using data to give context to your people plans and to drive your decisions, it might be something really simple. Are we offering the same salary? Are we offering a salary that's competitive in the marketplace? Or it could be, how do we optimize where we grow our business based on cost and availability? It might be that Elena from Lightcast came on and delivered a presentation that scared me silly because she talked about how often skills are changing and how we need to keep pace. Well, where are those skills and who holds them and how do we go with it? Or it might be more complex than that. It might be saying, okay, Elena said this, but this skill over here is really close to this skill over here. So let's have a look at the adjacency of skills now and start to think about, is there a different way that we can access them and how will that help our organization?
And I think on that one, Alessandra, last time when we were doing the webinar, we ended spending lots of time on those B strategies at the end. And
The
I think
famous 8 Bs then became 9.
exactly. And I think they play a role here too, because a lot of the things that Alison discussed and they require different strategies in action. And you can see about how a lot of those blocks that we were discussing in terms of, yes, some of it is bot automating, but then most of it is about training and building, etc. Plays a role here as well.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of talk, isn't there, about how do bots, how do humans, how do robots, how do artificial intelligence all come together, and the reality is that we need to start playing to what our strengths are as humans, right? And those strengths are cognitive skills and creative thinking and the ability to do things. And I think it's really interesting as we progress through this, through probably the next 24 months, right? I think it's really fast. What are the skills that as humans we don't need any longer? So I think Elena, loan officer was one of the jobs where you'd seen a big pace of change. Well, that implies that there's a bunch of skills within that job that could probably be automated, but there's a bunch of new skills that are much more about, okay, well, how do I teach that automation or how do I train that automation to make sure that it's making the right decisions over whether or not we give that loan or not? So it's not just, oh, here we are, let's automate that task and throw it. It's somebody needs to work with the technology in order to make it act and think in the most appropriate way. And that's what's so exciting about the next few years, I think.
Yes. Okay. So thanks so much for all your insights, Alison, and also thank you to Alessandra for the insights she shared from Monster. We are going. If you've dropped in the chat any question throughout the discussion, or if you have any question for us, we will be following up with the questions after the discussion. And yes. And keep an eye out because we have a third webinar out for this series that will come out probably on the other side of summer. So thank you, Alison.
No
Thank you,
problems.
Alessandra.
Thank you, Alessandra. Thank you, Elena. Take care.